Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the latest episode of People, Politics, and Prose, FPRI's conversations with authors about their works, their careers, and the ideas that drive them. I'm Ron Granieri, Templeton Education Fellow at FPRI and Associate Professor of History at the U.S. Army War College. I'll be your host and moderator for this discussion, and it's great to welcome you all to this event here for FPRI. I have to start with my disclaimer that my opinions expressed in this conversation are my own and not those of the United States Army War College, United States Army, or the Department of Defense. But I can promise you a conversation full of insight and opinion on a very important topic. All of us at FPRI, thank you for joining us, both live on Zoom and recorded on the FPRI YouTube page. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Americans are often chided for having short attention spans in international affairs and for a willingness to forget the last conflict once embroiled in a new one. Thus, events that once appeared vital and all-consuming can become footnotes, producing puzzled frowns where once they elicited confident pronouncements about their existential importance. Here at FPRI, of course, we try to push back against that rush to forget and to encourage our readers and listeners to remember that the past continues to influence the present. Indeed, often it's not really past at all. So it is with the U.S. war against the Islamic State, or ISIS. For a few years back in the teens, ISIS appeared to be an irresistible force, filling a power political vacuum in war-torn Syria and Iraq, attracting holy warriors from around the world, and threatening to establish a permanent caliphate in the region and a permanent source of extremist violence, threatening the world outside of the Levant. It took years to stop and then roll back the ISIS tide, culminating in the capture of the caliphate's notional capital of Raqqa in 2017. That military operation has been heralded as a major American military success. Yet the defeat of ISIS has not led to complete peace in the region, nor has it necessarily improved Washington's relations with the other players in the conflict. Why? In his new book, The U.S. War Against ISIS, How America and Its Allies Defeated the Caliphate, Dr. Aaron Stein analyzes the American approach to the Islamic State and concludes that the U.S. relied on two, quote, uniquely American mechanisms, air power and special forces, to defeat ISIS, which was both a strength and a weakness. The decision to maintain a very light American footprint had a specific geopolitical logic and succeeded on its own terms. At the same time, however, that strategy made it difficult for the U.S. to secure the peace, because to do so would require sustained engagement with the other actors in the region, especially Russia, something we have proven not quite willing or able to do. At the end of an engrossing, richly sourced book, which draws extensively on interviews with participants, Dr. Stein writes that the war exposed a, quote, deep political failing endemic to wars of choice, and offers lessons that should not be forgotten in the current rush to focus on great power conflict. What strategy did the U.S. pursue against ISIS? What impact did that strategy have on existing relationships with other players in the region? And what should we learn from it? These are some of the questions we will address today in our conversation with Dr. Aaron Stein. Dr. Aaron Stein is the Director of Research at FPRI. Previously, Dr. Stein was a resident senior fellow of the Atlantic Council. He also hosts the Arms Control Wonk and the Chain Reaction podcasts. A former doctoral fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, an associate fellow of the Royal United Services Institute in London, and a non-proliferation program manager at the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies in Istanbul. He has published in such journals as Survival and Russi Journal, Foreign Affairs, War on the Rocks, and The American Interest. He holds a BA in politics from the University of San Francisco, an MA in international policy studies with a specialization in non-proliferation from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, and a PhD in Middle East and Mediterranean studies from King's College, London. We're delighted to have him as an important part of the FPRI family, and we're especially delighted to have him with us today for this conversation. Good afternoon, Dr. Stein.
Good to see you, Ron. Thanks for that very nice intro, and happy to talk about my book, especially given everything that's going on with Russia. It may get lost in the shuffle.
Indeed, indeed. That's something we definitely don't want to have happen. So I have some questions to start off, and we do encourage our audience to participate. And I encourage those members of the audience who do have questions to use the Q&A function of the Zoom portal rather than the chat function. I'll be monitoring Q&A for your questions. So I want to start as I think I said in our conversation preparing for this, to get this out of the way at the beginning. Would a different American policy after 2011 have resulted in a different problem with ISIS, or perhaps even made the ISIS problem never occur at all?
I mean, I think you're here talking about the withdrawal from Iraq in 2011, right? Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think starting with the Iraq War and the influence the Iraq War had on American policy thereafter, but also the political debates that were taking place in the United States back around 2008 and how those then influence government policy moving forward on both, as I say, Democratic administrations and Republican administrations. What people often point to is the decision to withdraw U.S. forces from Iraq in 2011, when at least according to a lot of statistics, that the ISIS threat had largely been pacified. ISIS is the latest iteration of the group that the U.S. was primarily fighting, beginning with the insurgency that really began to kick off in, say, 2005-ish range, 2004, 2005, 2006. And so it is the direct ideological offshoot of the insurgents that the United States was fighting. And so by leaving in 2011, the United States essentially took its foot off the throat of a group that it had pacified. I think that's a little bit of wishful thinking, in that there were clear signs, and real experts who study this group is that the group, while had been was besieged, it had been laid siege to, and was clearly being pushed back, and was clearly feeling the pressure of both US and Iraqi forces. They had mainly gone underground. So they were still raising money. They were still capable of operating in insurgent networks. And so it became a question of when the US left, not if the US left, that there would be a resurgence of some kind. And all wars must end. And I think this influences thinking now. The book was written or finished a year or so ago, and there has been some changes on the Biden administration's policy. But what became increasingly clear in the interviews that I did is that some of the political constraints that the Obama administration placed upon, particularly elements of the U.S. military that are tasked with the counterterrorism mission, is that they felt handcuffed at the beginning of this, is that once they began to see ISIS begin to break out, before they sort of broke out and took over large swaths of Syria and Iraq, is there was ringing up the flagpole or the alarm bell that we have to go do something. And there was a political effort to say, Iraq's in the rear view. We're focusing on the pivots, or Asia, or great power competition, whatever the buzzword of choice is at the time. And so we're not going back to Iraq. We've won. And so there was a real mad dash once it became clear that the US had to go back not just to Iraq and to Syria, for this counterterrorism mission that it subsequently identified.
Well, and precisely that question of, we're out and we're not coming back. What role did the Syrian civil war play in the rise of ISIS, and what constraints did the ongoing Syrian civil war play on potential American responses to the rise of ISIS?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think this also goes back to policy, politics. It's inherently wrapped up in this. And one of the things that I talked about, and this came out of interviews on the U.S. political side, was there was a general consensus against interventionism as a policy moving forward, as a tool of American foreign policy, or the use of military abroad. A lot of this was informed by the U.S. intervention in Libya, if we all remember that, Odyssey Dawn, and the political challenges that Obama faced in carrying it out. One, he didn't want to, but then he ultimately did. Two, once he did, he was politically chastised from the right for violating the War Powers Act. Same on the left. There was a similar anti-war coalition that you see sort of brewing up, which is sort of far right and far left coming together. And so when Syria kicked off, there was this idea that we should stay out of this, and that this was not sort of the American war to fight. And there was also the assumption that if the US did nothing, Bashar would be toppled all on his own. Mm-hmm. And so as it grew into a civil conflict, there were all these debates about a no-fly zone or all these things. And then within that conflict, largely pushing out of Iraq, ISIS is mostly sort of an Iraqi thing. I mean, lots of foreigners come to it, but its genesis is in the insurgency in Iraq. It was able to push out, and then all of a sudden you had this moment, it was in June 2014, where, there was some nascent planning in the Pentagon, with White House support, which I discuss in the book in great detail, about what to do, and all sorts of planning that goes on. It's just a routine operation of civil servants being employed by the US government. All of a sudden it became the oh bleep moment. I use the real word in the book. It became the oh bleep moment, in that now you have to do something.
Yeah.
ISIS has taken over Iraq's largest city, and they're threatening Baghdad, and now we have to go. And that was really the genesis of actually active war planning in the conflict.
And so the planning began then in those later years of the Obama administration, so after not wanting to do anything. Because after all, Obama had come in saying, don't do stupid bleep. And then, of course, sometimes, well, the enemy has a vote, as they say. How did things change with the change in administration in Washington?
Well, I mean, I should say is that the Obama administration did authorize covert assistance, which wasn't so covert. The age-old adage of we're not doing anything, but then leaking what you're doing to the New York Times so that everybody knows what you're doing. And that was, that was definitely going on. And then this was one of the first wars, we can talk about this because this is coming up in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that was really readily documented on social media. And so you could, not me, but like internet sleuths could track where certain weapons were coming from. And then it didn't take a genius to put two and two together to say like this is part of a clandestine arms flow. So there was a US intervention. Its initial was just covert rather than overt. How did it change between Obama and Trump? Well, it didn't change all that much, to be honest with you. I mean, the Obama administration put together a plan which was very heavy on special forces, as I said, which is basically, Iraq was its own thing, Syria was its other thing. I really focus on Syria in the book, but it was grafting on small numbers of special forces to embed with certain elements in Syria in particular. And those forces were able to link up to provide weapons and training, and most importantly is to be able to coordinate US air power. So it kept the US footprint very, very small, which is keeping in the sort of overall ethos of no large foreign interventions because of the legacy of Iraq and Afghanistan. And then trying to essentially do this in a new way. We came up with a buzzword for it called by, with, and through. Other people calls it advise, assist, accompany. Essentially what it means is just US forces are not directly fighting the enemy, but they're assisting people to fight the enemy.
Right.
And the Trump administration continued that policy, but what they did do was delegate some of the authorities down lower, and they had a larger risk appetite for civilian casualties and the use of air power.
Well, and that's what I think well, two things come out of that. One is this idea about the use of air power and how does one apply it. But there is, whether intentional or not, there's an interesting ironic tone to the subtitle of your book. You say the United States and its allies defeated ISIS, because some of the allies in the war against ISIS are allies of the United States, like Turkey, which we'll talk about in a moment. And some of them are most decidedly not allies of the United States, like Russia, and yet they were allies in this fight. And so, I want to talk about how that worked. Right? And so we'll take it in two parts because each of them is complicated. I want to start, since I know that you've done extensive work on Turkey and Turkey's place in the Middle East. And so, how did the fight against ISIS both influence U.S.-Turkish relations, and how were U.S.-Turkish relations changed by the struggle against ISIS?
Sure. I mean, the ally I was talking about in the book title was the Syrian Democratic Forces, with the SDF.
So there you go. Right.
And they're not actually an ally. Sometimes you use shorthand in book titles to sound a little bit more pithy. The U.S. would call them a partner. And what that means is, like, essentially what the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, is it's the Syrian branch of what's called the Kurdistan Workers' Party. The Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK for short, is a terrorist group that the U.S. has recognized since 1997 because it's an insurgent group inside of Turkey that has been battling that central government since, depending on where you backdate it, probably till 1984, but even before then. So the U.S., in choosing to partner with the SDF, the Syrian Kurds for short, was automatically on the wrong side of Turkey. And I think it's important, and this is something I document in the book as well, sometimes things just happen. You know, when the war plan was sketched out, the war plan was not go find a local partner force that the Turks hate and go battle ISIS. It was who's available and who's ready to go. And I have a great quote in the book, you know, where the first people into Syria were part of Delta Force, JSOC. They find the Kurds. They find the Kurds largely because of a relief operation in Iraq in this place called Sinjar. And if everybody remembers, this was the near genocide of this very small minority of Iraqi sort of, they're hard to classify in terms of their spiritual beliefs because they're Yazidis. Some people call them Kurds. Some of them don't even like being called Kurds. The point is they were stuck on this mountain and they were threatened with extinction. And this was really a trigger for the US to sort of expand its scope of airstrikes in Iraq. To assist this, there was people inserted onto this mountain, and then they link up with these people who were running a relief convoy basically on the other side of the mountain that just happened to be the SDF/PKK. There's all sorts of greater ties I could go into there. But all of a sudden, the plan started working. Right? You had this sort of plucky force that was fighting, who put up a heroic resistance in Kobani, this town right on the border. It was the first decisive US win in the war against ISIS. It was really a Kurdish win. And so you come out the other end and you have all this territory that's being gobbled up by this group, and nobody really wrapping their heads around the implications because it's going so fast. Then all of a sudden it's, wow, the Turks are really upset about what's happening. The other complicating factor here is that Turkey was being a very difficult country to deal with on the bilateral level with the US. We wanted access to an airbase in Turkey, and Ankara was trying to hold out to use it to extract its own concessions from the United States. And they didn't want to support the SDF. They wanted to support these other rebels, most of which were getting arms through the covert program. And so you had this whole mishmash of things and conflicting interests that smashed together, and it still to this day has not been resolved in terms of tensions.
Right. And what was the Turkish, more broadly, the Turkish attitude towards the Syrian civil war? The Turkish relationship with Bashar's regime in Damascus was complicated.
Complicated. I mean, yes, you know, the ruling coalition in Turkey had come to see the Assad regime as a key enabler of the Middle East policy, really in the early to mid 2000s.
Okay.
You know, and so they viewed particularly, you know, Aleppo as a key conduit, both for tourism coming from Syria to Turkey to go shopping in all these fancy new shopping malls that they had built up, you know, and for Turkish overland trucking via Syria to richer parts of the Middle East down in the Gulf. And if, you know, again, for most people on this call, they won't know this, but there was no visas. You could just walk across the border. They had eliminated visa restrictions. And so a Turkish passport actually got you across to Syria, and a Syrian passport got you across to Turkey. They joined sort of the global push to remove Bashar in August 2011. After trying to negotiate with him for a series of months to make some sort of token concessions to the uprising against him. And then their attitude hardened, and then they became the conduit through which material and supply was supplied to the sort of non-ISIS insurgents against the Syrian government, against the Syrian regime. But as a counterpoint to that, they didn't police their border, and they became the main thoroughfare for foreigners who were, you know, going abroad to join the Islamic State. Mm-hmm. And it was that tension between Turkey leaving its border open, its dissatisfaction with the US war policy with the Syrian Kurds, and the holding out of the use of the airbase that further degraded US-Turkish relations, you know, before the airbase was ultimately opened. And as I said, has still not been resolved to this day.
Right. And of course, then there's the irony that Turkey's a member of NATO. And so the United States and Turkey have both a very strong bilateral relationship, historical bilateral relationship, but also within NATO. But if Turkey is upset with the United States about policy towards Syria, this, of course, brings the Turks, going back to more historical developments, right, is the Turkish relationship with Russia. And the role of Russia in Syria, the role of Turkish-Russian relations, right? This is where, I mean, we're beyond triangular relationships here, right? I guess we're going to get into various quadrilateral relationships or pentagonal relationships. But how does Russia fit in then to this this developing struggle against ISIS, but also in the various relationships that exist in the region?
Yeah, I mean, the Russians made a political decision to intervene in Syria, and to use military forces to do so. They were providing political protection at the United Nations Security Council, and Russian experts, who were talking about the reasons for the Kremlin doing this, they're broadly analogous to some of the complaints that Putin was making in his demands of NATO before the invasion of Ukraine, which is that he felt, and I think this is fundamentally true, is that the Russians, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, felt powerless in the in sort of the broader international community to stop what they view as Western wars of choice, from Bosnia to Kosovo, and then culminating in Libya, where they felt like they were taken for a ride by the Obama administration about what it is that they supported at the UN Security Council about a no-fly zone. Now, there's still debates about whether this is Russian cynicism. The point is that by the time they intervened in Syria, they felt like they too should get into this game, and they felt like Bashar himself his grip on power was weakening, or I think more likely that the war had stalemated and that he couldn't win. He wouldn't lose, but he wouldn't win. And so a decisive Russian intervention on his behalf could not only shore him up and protect him, but could ensure that he could win in the conflict and thereby prevent an American victory. There's a paranoia to this, but like it's not irrational.
Well, and there is the complexity there that Russia also offers President Obama a lifeline when Obama wants to, when Bashar crosses the red line on the use of chemical weapons, but Obama realizes very quickly he doesn't have the political support for military action. The United States is sort of stuck until the Russians come in and say, we'll take care of the. We will negotiate a resolution to the chemical weapons question, and we can talk about whether that was actually a solution to chemical weapons. But that the United States, for that brief period in 2013, 2014, actually sort of welcomes Russian participation because it saves us from having to deal with something we don't want to deal with. I know a lot of our audience probably has opinions on this, and I'm always very curious about this too. Is how do we understand, if Russia so re-enters the Middle East after a couple decades of being excluded in the late Cold War and post-Cold War world, they re-enter in part because the United States decides that it's no longer in American short-term interest to keep them out.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Russians successfully or accurately understood that if they chose to go to war, nobody was going to stop them. The idea, the pressure points to do that at sort of let's say a fagonal war to American interests do not rise to the level that we've seen in recent weeks, right? With this level of economic coercion that we've placed upon them for the invasion of Ukraine. 2013 with the red line, the August 2013, the use of chemical weapons, as I document in the book, it was the catalyst in the Obama administration to increase their covert support for the Syrian opposition, for the non-ISIS insurgency against the regime. It was the catalyst for them to open the floodgates, to increase the lethal aid to these groups, and to try and increase the pressure on Bashar. There was a diplomatic push on the same level to try and resolve this at the Geneva Convention. But on the chemical weapons side, the reality is while there was contingency planning at certain levels to try and secure Syrian chemical facilities, they were dispersed. They were a long ways apart from each other. To do something about them would require the type of intervention that the Obama administration didn't want to do, which was a large-scale military operation. So the Russian offer at that time, and this is before they committed overt ground troops, made no sense. I mean, it made sense to me as an analyst, keeping in mind that nobody in the arms control community, because as you read my bio, that's what I did my MA in, thought that they would get all the weapons out. There's been no cases, like the Libyan is the case study is the closest example to this. And Gaddafi held weapons back. And we all assumed Assad would hold weapons back, but it would decrease the threat to a certain amount. On the military side, when they intervened 2 years later, this catalyzed another change in Obama policy, which was to increase the actual amount of US forces in Syria. So while there was one element of special forces that was permanently in Syria, they were very quiet, and it was, under different types of authorities. It allowed for sort of US Army special forces to be put in certain numbers to sort of wall off areas where the US was actively fighting ISIS. And then we sort of split the country in two. The Northeast became like the ISIS zone where the US was fighting ISIS. And then on the other side, the Russians really began to take it to those opposition groups that were receiving covert funding to fight the regime. And so while we were in sort of conflict with each other, there were sort of divergent aspects to what each side was doing.
And how did this work in practice? You talk about dividing the country, but when I think about especially dealing with airspace, right? How did American and Russian air forces keep out of each other's way when dealing with Syria and with ISIS?
Well, I mean, at first with difficulty, bringing this full back to Turkey, if you think about the country divided in thirds, it's like, Syria sort of looks like that. Like that side was, where the active non-ISIS opposition was. There was this pocket here in the middle, and then you had this whole northeast section. The northeast section was ISIS land, but ISIS had occupied a strip of territory right along the border. And the Turks had said, we don't want the SDF coming across the river, the Euphrates River. And so the US had spent a significant amount of diplomatic time and military effort to try and work out like a non-Kurdish solution to this little pocket. It's called the Manbij pocket. It didn't go very well. It didn't go very well for a number of reasons, but just as the operation was sort of about to kick off, like the joint operation with the Turks, to sweep from west to east to link up with the river and therefore keeping the Kurds on the other side of the river, the Russians started bombing. And so you had very tense interactions of US planes and Russian planes, and for a while, Turkish planes, all sort of meeting at this one point. And so because both sides are professional militaries, we agreed to a basic deconfliction line, which was along altitude blocks. You stay here, we stay here. And so that way we don't run into each other, because a lot of this stuff is at night. The Russians at times would use this like to try and coerce, but where it really became, this was in 2015, where it really became sort of tense. And there were tense interactions in 2015, but that part of Syria, there was far less American presence than in the northeastern part, was when the Russians and the regime had managed to solidify their own gains and push out to the northeast to border the river. And then you really had these tense friction moments. Mm-hmm. And there was a negotiation of what's called the Deconfliction Plus channel, along with a ground deconfliction. So you had ground deconfliction, and then above it, you had the Deconfliction Plus, which wasn't just altitude blocks. It was, we'll fly here, you'll fly here. This is what we'll be carrying. This is what you'll be carrying. Try not to fly here. Try not to fly here. That didn't mean that anybody drew a force field around the river. It just meant that if you were to cross the river, you would let the other side know. And if you didn't, you would have friction between the two sides.
Well, and speaking of friction, there are two events that take place at different times with regard to this whole conflict, One is, the Turks end up shooting down a Russian plane. Mm-hmm. Am I correct on that? And the other one is a group of American Special Forces operatives end up in a firefight with a group from the Wagner Group.
Yep. This
Russian, mercenary, but not quite completely non-governmental organization. What was the result of those two moments, let's say, of non-deconfliction? What did that mean for how the overall project continued?
Yeah, so the first was in November 2015, and that it was basically the Russians had intervened in September. So this was right at the outset of their own bombing campaign. They began to violate the Turkish border. Mm-hmm. Whether that's by incompetence or on purpose, to this day we don't know. But they would violate it for like 6 seconds. Mm-hmm. So they weren't flying deep into Turkey. and a lot of the interviews in the books are with U.S. Air Force pilots. The Turks were maintaining strict control of their border, at least in the air. At this point, they had not yet shut the border to the cross-border flow of ISIS fighters. And so there were strict air corridors that you were supposed to fly into, especially for U.S. pilots that were flying out of Turkey. So when Russians would approach the border, they would talk to them, and they would talk to them on sort of what's called as guard frequency. The Russians never responded. So the Turks kept saying, if we cross our border, we're going to do something. We cross our border, we're going to do something. And one day they did something, shot it down.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they shot it down, I interviewed a lot of US pilots who thought that air operations from Turkey would actually be canceled as a way to say, because at the time it was F-16s that US had there, and US and Turkey both fly F-16s. And they didn't want an accident where Russians would shoot down an American on accident, and then you really have a big blow up between the two sides. The U.S. reassured the Turks by deploying F-15s from Lakenheath to Turkey, and they helped them with patrols. But the Russians that's really when they began to expand their bombing right along that jump off point that I was talking about. So that plan for the Membish pocket, or from that part out to the river that I was just talking about, really started to evaporate. And so you had US pilots that would often be intercepted and interdicted by Russian pilots as they were flying along those lines. And of course, we're all still here. So like they were able to manage that to this day. But like it really was like the Russians pushing with their Air Force out. The second one was on the Wagner Group, which, I mean, I have to say, nobody quite understands the Russian rationale for what they did, right? But as a outcome of the Deconfliction Plus talks in 2017, there was a carve out for a small Russian position on the, let's call it the American side of the Euphrates River. And they bust out of the Russian little zone. It was a 1x4 kilometer box towards this area, this oil facility near the city of Deir ez-Zor, and the U.S. used the deconfliction line. We're watching you. What are you doing? Explain what's going on. Explain what's going on. And the Russians said they don't belong to us. We don't know who they are. Right? There was one last warning where we said, like, look, if they don't back off, they're about ready to get evaporated. And then I think what the unreported stuff is that the Russian side actually began to shoot first, and they called what's bracket fire, and that stuff fell behind the U.S. Special Forces and in front of them, and they determined that they were being bracketed, which is like aiming your artillery or your rockets.
Right.
And then it was open season, and basically the entire weight of the U.S. Air Force came down on these guys, and they all died. I mean, quite frankly, they all died. The other unreported fact of this is that the Russians did launch aircraft, but we launched aircraft in response, and we held them away. We said, don't come any closer. This is not your business. I'm paraphrasing here, but this is all in the book. And eventually the Russians did call to knock it off so that they could collect their war dead. But this is one of those incidents, that very odd. Nobody quite understands Russian behavior in this one. And they use the fact that these people were involved in a private mercenary group, which is many people assume is a way of plausible deniability for the Russian MOD, to try and probe American defenses, or at least maybe went rogue for a couple of hours to see if they couldn't quickly capture some important piece of Syrian infrastructure. Nobody quite knows, but that was another incident in the conflict.
Right. Well, and it is such a puzzle, because in a military that does not allow for a great deal of improvisation by individual officers, it's hard to imagine this group going rogue. And yet, if whatever information the Russians got, right, they didn't do it again.
No, they didn't do it again, but again, there would be friction points in the air, but the big challenge for US pilots, particularly as the war pushed out of Raqqa, and was pushing down the river, was again that they were running up against Russian pilots, and they would cross the river, and they would cross the river fully loaded,
right,
and they would overfly US positions,
right.
And so this is a no-no, right? In air doctrine, but do you shoot them down? Do they know where the US people are? And then they would drop weapons on the other side of the river, right? On the American side of the river, which again is not ruled out by deconfliction. It's just like it wasn't reported. And they would strike near US positions. But ISIS was on that side, right? But ISIS was shooting into regime territory, and the regime was shooting back at ISIS. And then you had Kurds shooting at ISIS, but who thought that they were shooting at the regime. Like it really, like it's just this sort of frog and friction about war.
Right.
And so you had these US pilots in these moments being like, do I shoot the Russian down because he's about ready to drop on an American? Or is he, it's usually a guy, is he mistaken? And should I let this one go, or do I use some other means to try and dissuade him from his flight path? And so you had these moments where US would sort of like cut him off, and it's called a headbutt, like to create this turbulence so that they would have an uncomfortable couple of seconds and try and divert path.
Well, and what do we know about any larger scale results of these interactions with the Russians, right? You know, was there communication at the flag officer level, right? At the general officer level, or even at the political level or diplomatic level, or did we just, as long as war didn't break out between the United States and Russia, everybody just kept going about their business? And so what have we taken away from all this?
The constant communication works. You know, there was constant communication. You know, a lot of the tense interactions was basically Russia pushing for that deconfliction plus mechanism. They always wanted, at least according to US officials, some sort of broad mechanism to cooperate, you know, which is against US law, but to coordinate the fight against ISIS, thereby legitimizing their own intervention. We're not here to protect Bashar, we're here to fight terrorists. That's always been their thing.
Right.
You know, and so they were always pushing and prodding around the outskirts to try and force the US into this. And so the deconfliction plus, well, they got closer. There was a long number of talks in Geneva around this thing called the joint, oh God, I can't remember it, but essentially it was a way for the two sides to exchange basic information about the battle picture and carve out areas where they could strike. It got close, but it ultimately blew up. But the idea was always that there would be some overarching legitimization for the Russians. And there were talks both in Jordan and in Geneva at multiple different levels, at the military level, at the political level, in support of how to do this, either coordinate or on the military operation. One thing learned, particularly out of the discussions with the US in Geneva for some humanitarian corridors, if this sounds familiar, for what's going on in Ukraine at the moment, is that the Russians really would believe, or really would propagate in private, a lot of the things that they said in public. So a lot of these crazy conspiracy theories that's like we sort of hand wave away, is that they would bring them up in private. And it would force like US negotiators to respond. And when they responded, they would just hand wave it away and say, yeah, that's BS anyways. It was an exercise in like just kind of keeping us off balance. And another thing that US officials would often bring up about their interactions with the Russians is extreme cohesiveness in their team. It's always the same players. So it's not a constant rotation that you see in the US, either on 6 months assignments or 2 years assignments. And so after 2 years, basically you have to plus up the US team, and like you have all this muscle memory that has to be relearned. It's always the same Russians. It's always the same games. And so like you sort of go through these cycles. But once you would reach agreement with them, they would more or less abide by it. It was the game of getting the agreement that ultimately was the huge challenge. And then once it was agreed to, things would usually calm down and professionalism would take over between the two sides.
Interesting. I'm obviously, because of current events, right? There's a lot of interest precisely in this question of what does this mean for the relations with the Russians? Yeah. There's a question from the audience I want to bring in here to circle around this a little bit, and so I want to phrase it that the Russians, of course, viewed and framed their work in Syria as a struggle against Islamic extremism, and do we see any potential for any kind of blowback against the Russians in Ukraine from any of these extremist groups? I don't know why they would necessarily want to come and help the Ukrainians, but would they look for an opportunity to get revenge against the Russians?
I mean, I think in general, not maybe amongst the extremist groups,
Okay.
the broad sort of Syrian opposition defies easy explanation.
Yep.
And if you ever read something that sort of casts them all as extremists or like all as ISIS, I would dismiss that. Or if you like read something that casts them all as sort of like peace-loving Gandhis, I would dismiss that too. There's all levels of intermingling in between. But the general sort of response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine that I've seen is members of the Syrian opposition who sort of like have achieved some level of notoriety because of their large social media followings, like offering to go help Ukraine. Like this isn't really going to happen, right? like this isn't a serious offer, nor is it really all that important in the context of what the Ukrainians are actually facing at the other end of the Russian armed forces. But I think it's important to ultimately point out that, I think what Russia has gained here is like perhaps in response to making a lot of people mad at it, is that it's solidified its presence in Syria.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It has forever access to an air base now on the Mediterranean and an expanded naval base on the Mediterranean. And that's actually played a part in this Ukraine conflict, because at the beginning of it, the Russians deployed a Tu-22, these bombers that are part of Russian capabilities to shoot at US ships, to be simplistic. And they're basically signaling, don't run up the straits. Don't go from the North Mediterranean through the Aegean and the Marmaris up into the Black Sea. You stay here because we can make your life difficult here. And we don't want any American intervention in the crisis in Ukraine. So like, that's how I think Syria would ultimately play out, and is playing out in the current context.
So the way that you describe the war on ISIS is certainly from a certain American perspective, right? It's a victory for American arms, right? Or at least ISIS is defeated. Is it also a Russian victory? And do those two victories, are they basically two different conflicts? Do they cancel each other out? How do they mix together?
Look, the American victory in Syria was that both the Obama and Trump administrations, from day one, again, like I would say that these are two very different administrations in their ideological outlook. They ultimately came down to very similar sort of pursuits and desired political outcomes, which is that we're just here to fight terrorists.
Mm-hmm. Right.
We're not here to change Syrian governance. We're not here to bring democracy. Like, yes, there is a State Department effort that's tasked with trying to negotiate ceasefires in this conflict, but it is largely untethered from the military conflict. The Biden administration's continued this. The Biden administration is leaving forces in Syria and Iraq, but it's simply counterterrorism, and they've been very clear about that. So in that sense, it's a victory. We resisted, the U.S. resisted sort of those grandiose divergence of political and military aims that you saw in the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq. That leaves a lot of people dissatisfied the outcome because Bashar's still there, right? So that naturally leads you to the fact that, did Russia win? I don't know what Russia won. Like, they won in that they made sure that their client, or like their partner, wasn't toppled.
Right.
But the U.S. was never going to topple them in the first place. It would have been so it's unclear. It's murky. But I think I do think that the military outcome for Russia was sustainable. I think the cost is sustainable. Perhaps that's changing now with the sanctions, and they have a permanent presence on the Mediterranean now. So I think it depends on how you define outcomes.
Right. As with so many things, right? In another 5-10 years, right, the outcome may look a little different than it does now.
Yeah, we don't know.
Yeah. There is a question Prince Heinsohn asks about what lessons have been learned from an American air power and some military power perspective, right? So what have we learned about the uses of air power and the uses of special forces from this experience that could help us to understand how those forces could be used in the future, both good and bad?
So I'll start at the very, very tactical and niche, right?
Yeah.
There were a lot of lessons learned from the initial strikes in Iraq, stuff like mapping, like there were no U.S. uniformed personnel at the outset of this war. So how do you tell friend from foe when they're driving the same vehicles? You're watching them from 30,000 feet, right? They're all driving American kit. And so who's who? Because if you strike the wrong person, particularly at the beginning, you completely undermine your relationship with the partner forces that you're trying to cultivate and ultimately fight on your behalf.
Right.
So a lot of fun, interesting stuff like about how they did that. Two, it validated this small footprint concept, which is that you can use small numbers of troops to really dedicate a very precise air campaign. Like two things can be true at the same time. One is that this is the most precise air campaign in US history. I think that that's true. And that thousands of civilians were also killed. These things are actually not intention.
Right.
You can diminish the amount of inadvertent civilian casualties as you move forward, but you can't necessarily eliminate it. Also, niche on the sort of niche and tactical side. Satellite communications were a major pain for US pilots because people could piggyback and watch the war in real time. If you were close enough to Iraq, you could pick up a signal that could be repeated, and the general could be watching it in the Pentagon. The general could then pick up the phone and say, no, I want you to strike over here. So significant handcuffs on the way that the US was able to use force. And then finally, more broadly, is that light footprint isn't that light. The amount of assets that were needed to sustain this air campaign were small by sort of comparisons to Gulf War or Kosovo or sort of these large interventions in the post-Cold War era, but really large, for a comparative, it's a non-state actor. Let's be serious. ISIS was never going to threaten to topple the United States. And so this inherent tension, as we do pivot to focusing on Russia or China, how you cut down the amount of assets needed to fight a small war while you need to free up stuff for the big war. And so there is stuff that's in tension here.
Because there is that problem of, you can use the United States has enormous air power, right? It has the two largest air forces in the world, right? The United States Air Force and the United States Navy. But you can use bazookas to swat flies if you want to. But is that, at what point does the amount of resources that you need to use in order to accomplish something, do you reach diminishing returns?
And that comes on the context of 20 years of occupations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and an air force that's the oldest and smallest it's ever been in US history.
Mm-hmm.
And we're at the front end of a recapitalization project because of delays in the F-35 program. And so you can just go on and on and on. It exacerbates ongoing problems that need to be addressed through continued sustainment of the armed forces, and yet they are always asked to do something. Like you see calls now, these crazy calls to do a no-fly zone over Western Ukraine. Totally preposterous, like from a number of like escalatory reasons with the Russians, but from a practical point, not the best use of US air power.
Right. And then the relationship between air power and ground forces, that this relates to your larger question, right? That there's something very American, and I agree with you on this, and I was glad to see it in your book. There's something very American about wanting to believe that the technology of air power and maybe the application of a few special forces can accomplish great things, because the United States has always been uncomfortable with major land invasions. That's always a last resort, and yet. Right. You can bomb things from 30,000 feet, but somebody has to decide who's running things on the ground. And so in this case, right, the United States relied on other people largely, right, small special forces, and relied on our partners. Did we learn anything new about the relationship between air power and control of the ground from this conflict that we can take into other conflicts, or are we still stuck with this idea that my professor in Great Power War in graduate school was none other than John Mearsheimer. And he always talked about how you can bomb things all you want, but eventually somebody's got to walk into City Hall and say, I'm in charge here. And so how do we figure out the lessons we've learned about controlling the ground, or wanting to see the people that we want to see control the ground?
Well, it's the story is still to be written.
Yeah.
The lessons, or at least some of the mythology about Iraq, and the mythology around some of the successes about the surge or the awakening, or basically the period of American quote unquote victory in Iraq from 2007 to 2011 completely permeated how this war was thought about. It was, and then criticized.
Right.
A lot of that criticism was that you chose the wrong partner force because you used a Kurdish force that Turkey hates, and so you've turned Turkey off. and that you're asking this Kurdish force to push into Arab majority populations, and then Arabs will have to be governed by Kurds. And this will inherently not work. You need to get a fighting force that resembles the local population for legitimization, to ensure that disaffected males in particular don't go out and join the Islamic State once this is all over.
Right.
This is still to be determined about whether or not that this sort of like staple of American assumptions about conflict, particularly in Iraq and Syria, will hold true. The anecdotal evidence suggests that using small fractured groups doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And that the real successes of this war is that the SDF PKK were so unified is that they could actually run they could actually control large numbers of people. I'm not going to say that they could run a coherent war with all the logistics that implies, but they could approximate it in a good enough way. But zooming out, right? Like who will run this when this is over? This was always the big question mark. Bashar is still in power, and so the open-ended question that we're still grappling with is the Kurds control a lot of territory. The regime controls a lot of territory. Even the Turks control some territory. They ultimately invaded a few times, as I talk about in the book. Right. Somebody has to marry these people up, and that comes back to uncomfortable political questions. Just one more point on this: the American way of war, which was the original the original title I wanted was a very American war, but it was changed. You can't divorce this from politics. The allure of air power and special operations forces is that you don't have to declare war. Right. Congress doesn't have to be involved. They are involved in supplementary ways to appropriate money. And you're actually seeing this in Ukraine right now. It's the appropriation of money and authorities for the Department of Defense to do something. Right. It was the same with this war. It's the appropriation of money and authorities. And so you can escape oversight, and you can sidestep the very uncomfortable question that if this was actually put to the American Congress or the American people as, do you support invading Syria? The answer would have been no. And so you can keep this stuff on the down low while still prosecuting a war to achieve some desired political outcomes.
Sure. We have an FPRI animated primer on war powers. And the best part about that is realizing the United States hasn't declared war on anybody since June of 1942. Right. And goodness knows, right? So in the past 80 years, we haven't fought a war with anybody, except when we have.
Yeah, no, I mean, even the term no-fly zone is sort of a euphemism for armed conflict, a way to get around it, because no-fly zone is an active war.
Is an active war, right? Because if you're denying somebody access to a piece of land, you are doing that. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, and so two final questions. We're almost out of time, but one of them is, what's the nature of the ISIS threat today after all this?
It's hard to tell. I think the group survives, obviously, in dispersed pockets in relatively ungoverned spaces in the Syrian and Iraqi deserts. And we have to assume that they have presence in major urban areas as a way to collect rents. They operate a lot like the mafia, and that pay up or we'll kill you. Right. But significantly degraded. Significantly degraded. And I think as the recent raid in northwestern Syria that killed the latest caliph of ISIS, the latest leader of ISIS, demonstrates the US is still hunting them. And so in some respects, to bring this full circle to the 2011 question, Biden was around in 2011. I know the Secretary of Defense Austin was around in 2011. Many of the same people that were in the Obama administration are back now, and they do seem to have adopted a sort of slimmed down counterterrorism model as the best way to keep up presence on the group moving forward, to try and prevent the breakout and resurgence that we saw in 2014.
And connected to that, I see Prince Heinzen has another question, but I want to bend it a little bit and say, do we know, is there much continuity among Russian leadership? Are people who are running the operation in Ukraine, for example, did they run the operation in Syria, or are we talking about completely different leaders?
Well, what we know about the Russian armed forces is that they wanted to bloody their force. And so they sent a lot through Syria as a way to like build up some skills.
Right.
And so a lot of the open source imagery you see of downed Russian jets in Russia, there are plane spotters who are picking those up in Syria. So I have to assume that there's significant overlap in the officer corps who spent time in Syria and are now involved in the invasion of Ukraine. I think this not to make this about Ukraine, but I think the challenges the Russians are facing in Ukraine is because the corrupt authoritarian political leadership didn't pass the football off to the professionals, probably still corrupt, but more professionalized military leadership to actually plan a coherent campaign. And I think Syria probably differs in that respect.
Well, and there have been people who've talked about the danger that the Russians would draw the quote lesson from Syria and say, well, we know how to deal with Aleppo. And so if we can't deal with Kharkiv or with Mariupol or with Kyiv the way that we initially thought, we'll just treat them the way we treated Aleppo. What do you think about that? That might be that the Russians might simply just unleash the same level of their effort on air power and long range violence to break an enemy force?
I mean, that depends on the political outcome, on the political choice. Do they want to besiege Kiev and do the sort of the Grozny, the Aleppo,
right,
things that are in their back pocket whenever they want to, or will they stop? I mean, I have no idea. My initial assumptions going in is that the Russians didn't want actually urban conflict in Ukraine. And I think that shows in some of the shambolic things that they were doing at the outset. But plans adjust,
right.
And
they generally do.
It's up to them at this point if they want to really, I guess, pulverize that city into, because, urban combat, and I'll stop here, whether you're talking about Aleppo or even the US, and I'm not comparing the US military to the Russian military, but even the US, one of the vivid chapters in the book is about the US destruction of Raqqa to kill the remnants of ISIS. And American diplomats were walking into that city and they were describing buildings to me as sort of like heroin addicts, as sort of that sort of hunched lean, because of this tactic that we're using called kneecapping to collapse buildings on people. It's bad. And so when this ends, I think urban conflict is the great equalizer, and urban infrastructure is the great, besides humans, is one great casualty that will come out of this.
Right. Well, Aaron Stein, thank you so much. I know this is a complex subject, and it's a very rich book. We thank you for coming to us to talk about it today. I encourage the audience, if you are interested in what you've heard today, to pick up a copy of the U.S. War Against ISIS. It is available in bookstores, wherever fine books are sold, and there's a link to the book in the chat box for this conversation. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you, Aaron Stein, for sharing your insights with us.
Well, thank you. And as I tell my wife, if you can't sleep, pick it up. It'll help. Just kidding.
This is good advice for everybody. That's right. But FPRI would like to thank our sponsors and partners for their generous support in making programs like this possible. We thank all of you for joining us. Today's conversation is, however, just the beginning. The world goes on, and we will be here to discuss it here at FPRI. If you've enjoyed our discussion today, please tell a friend and bring a friend next time while we gather to analyze our complex world. Consider becoming a member or partner of FPRI. To keep up with future episodes of People, Politics, and Prose and other events at FPRI, visit our website, fpri.org, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. You can follow the host of this program on Twitter at Ronald Granieri. But until next time, for all of us here at FPRI, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us.